Hi, Chris Waddell. Thank you so much for joining us today on Traipsin Global on Wheels on our first series of podcasts. So, just for everyone who doesn't know him, his name is Chris Waddell. He in 1988 he was injured at a ski accident. However, that did not stop him. Just 2 months after his accident, he returned to college and then started monoskiing less than a year later, and was named the U.S. Disabled Ski Team a little more than 2 years later. He has 12 Paralympic medals and has become the most decorated male monoskier in history. He competed in 4 Winter Paralympics, winning 12 medals, and 3 Summer Paralympics, winning a silver medal in the 200 meters in Sydney. In December of 2009, Chris also became the first nearly unassisted paraplegic to summit Mount Kilimanjaro. And welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle.
Of course. So for our question, please share with us some helpful equipment that have helped you with your climb, either that be Kilimanjaro or other trails and hikes that you've gone on.
So the vehicle that I used to climb Kilimanjaro was a 4-wheeled hand cycle, and it actually articulated, so each wheel would move as much as 14 inches, so it was kind of a rock crawler kind of thing. I could roll up and over rocks. That technology was designed by a guy named Mike Oxberger in Massachusetts, who developed a 3-wheeled one and set up the whole geometry and the drivetrain, the rear-wheel drive, which for us in a hand cycle, like my road hand cycle, is really challenging. If I am on a dirt road and I have to go up a hill, I just start losing traction because all of my weight is over the rear wheels as opposed to the front wheel. The vehicle that I used to climb Kilimanjaro, all the weight is over my rear wheels, which makes the traction that much better. So we did that. My guide, actually Dave Penny, took a bit of what Mike had designed and fine-tuned it for the Kilimanjaro. So we recreated a different one, a different vehicle, and that's what we used going up Kilimanjaro, and that's what people can use off-road. There are a variety of different companies. Mike's one-off company is a guy named Jake O'Connor who does one in Crested Butte, Colorado. There are a variety of different builders. Some of the wheelchair manufacturers are doing off-road hand cycles now too. And so I would just recommend to people they can Google off-road hand cycles and they can get a fair amount of information.
Great. What are some mid and then also some just very beginner level trails or just mountains that you would recommend that individuals who are interested in this area should get started with?
I think the place to start is really on more of a dirt road kind of thing. The pitch of whatever trail or road that you're going on is the thing that determines how difficult it is. It is just it's challenging going uphill. So first is the pitch, and then is the terrain. One of the things that I found really challenging going uphill and downhill on Kilimanjaro were sort of like the rock gardens. They call them little baby heads. It looks like these little rocks that are kind of like the size of a baby head. And so, going up and down was difficult, having to pick a line going through these things where if you're hiking, you kind of step onto it and it's not that big a deal. But in the hand cycle, it makes it a little bit more challenging. So the pitch and then whatever the terrain is. And so people...
Next we're going to transition more to travel in general. So you've traveled to a number of countries and various continents, right? Can you share with us where you've traveled?
Okay. I mean, I think I've traveled. I've not been everywhere in the world by any means, but I've been on every continent, I think, short of Antarctica. So I don't know that that's on the bucket list or not. We'll see. It sounds cold down there. But
what are some of your favorites? I always find it hard to list one favorite. Or so, like, what are some places, groups of countries, or what continent do you enjoy the most?
I feel like going to Africa was absolutely amazing, and it's so culturally different, and that's part of the reason you travel. You don't want to travel somewhere and have it be exactly the same as where you came, because then why travel? And Africa, I think culturally was just amazing. Big wide open spaces. We did a little bit of safari when we were there to see some of the animals, and some of these things are really very cool. I enjoy spending a fair amount of time in Western Europe as well. I generally spend I'm probably in London a couple of times a year or something like that. My wife works in London, so I generally go over there a couple of times, which I'm getting to know more and more. It seems like oftentimes when you go someplace, the more you know about it, the more exciting it is. After I finished my Paralympic career, I went back to Europe. I was competing in Greece. I came home. I dropped off all of my stuff. I hopped on a plane, and I sort of did a little bit of a celebration trip. And I went to Rome and Florence, which I thought was really interesting for me as somebody in a wheelchair. I really thoroughly enjoyed Rome. I could get around without having to take a taxi anywhere. My goal oftentimes was to go out and get lost. And I would see things. And it's not a huge city. You don't feel like you're going great distances. And I felt like I could see a lot of stuff. I could see, I could go to the Vatican. I did see the Sistine Chapel, which if you do that, hire a guide and go early in the morning so that you can see everything. Because if you get there early before they open, then you actually can see what's going on. Where for us, the view is often obstructed by people who are taller than we are, so we can't see as much. Hire a guide. It gets you in earlier. It's a great way to do it. I did, while I was there, things that you have to do, right? I mean, when can you ever go around a complete country under your own power in an afternoon? So I traversed, I circumvented, I guess, the Vatican City. Vatican City is its own country, right? Smallest country in the world. And I think it was about like 6 miles or something like that. Some of it was a little bit dicey. I don't know if I completely recommend it because some of the roads got a little bit narrow. I had some nun who I think told me in Italy that I really shouldn't be here and that I was in big trouble. And I thanked her, and hopefully she said a prayer for me or something, because I did make it. But to do some of those kinds of things, and some of it is being willing to kind of muscle your way through it. There are definitely cobblestones, and some of that can be a challenge. But I found Rome to be a relatively easy place to get around. And granted, I was coming off of competing, so I was relatively fit. To go up to the Medici Museum at the top of the Spanish Steps was a challenge. There is a road that goes up, basically from the same, has the same elevation gain effectively as the Spanish Steps, but there's a road, and it's a little bit steep. It's definitely a challenge, but sometimes that makes it more exciting if you're sort of in for the adventure.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I went to Rome a couple years ago, and so aside from Rome, what other cities for those wheelchair users who are nervous about traveling should they start with first? I agree with you that Rome is relatively accessible. If they don't have elevators, they do have those stair lifts. I don't know if they were there when you traveled there a few years back, but I saw that they had a pretty good plan B. Plan A wasn't too great, but plan B was all right.
Rome was surprisingly accessible for such an old city. I think that was it. And oftentimes it's good for us too, because you were often entering through the exit. So you don't have to wait in line as much, which is great. Other cities that I enjoy, certainly in North America, I would say, Toronto's a really cool city on the lake. So much cultural diversity, beautiful place. New York, I find, is a relatively easy place. There's a bit of a theme coming up here in that I often in New York I often don't take cabs in New York, and they're getting more and more accessible and everything. I think that I was there when I had absolutely no money, so I got into the habit of not taking cabs because it was much cheaper not to take a cab. But it's much more accessible now with the cabs, with the SUVs, where you can put your chair in the back. The cab drivers it states in the cab that they are not allowed to deny access to anyone, which makes it a whole lot easier, because as someone in a wheelchair, I felt like there were often times when I was there a while ago where I'd be there with a friend and I'd say, okay, you hail a taxi and I'm going to hide so that they don't know that I'm going to get in the taxi too, and then we'll get in the taxi. But now it's much better. They are not allowed to deny service to anyone. New York is great. I think Vancouver's a really cool city. It's really beautiful. That drive up to Whistler is one of the most spectacular drives. It's obviously a bit hilly in Vancouver. The Canadians do accessibility pretty well. San Francisco is another one of my favorite cities, but at the same time, that is most assuredly a hilly city where and cabs are a bit of a challenge, I think, in San Francisco. It's where I first started using Uber, actually, just because I found it a challenge. And Uber seems to make it a whole lot easier in a place like San Francisco, where you can get a ride pretty much wherever you want to go. Sydney's another place that is absolutely spectacular. Sydney, Australia, now changing gears on you, which I think is great. Sydney is beautiful. There's so many different things to see. I mean, from the harbour bridge to the opera house and they're such a friendly people, and it seems like everybody's on an adventure all the time. I think Sydney is a great place. Again, back in Western Europe, just jumping around all over the place on you. I think that I love going to Switzerland. Switzerland's one of those places that it seems like there's a spectacular view around every corner, and you're just driving along the highway and suddenly you see a castle and you think, wow, that is really cool, and I'm just on the highway. And so that those are some of my favorite places. I've not spent a ton of time in the Far East. I competed in Japan and found that relatively easy. I don't remember. In some ways, it was kind of like I was there competing, and so a lot of my travel and everything was all handled. I think going to China, going to like the Great Wall or something like that is something that I have done. I wasn't able to do too much of it. From the entrance, I was able to go along and sort of experience being on the Great Wall, but it gets to be really, the steps get to be really, really steep. And I went there by myself. So I was willing to do a bit, but there were certain things that I just wasn't able to do. But yet again, I think that sometimes it's just a matter of trying to figure out how we can get where we want to go. Mm-hmm. Hawaii is another place that I've really enjoyed and would highly recommend. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow, those are a lot of cities. So listeners, you can obviously get started with. That'll get you really busy there. I agree with you, Chris, that when I was living in New York, I lived there for a couple of years, and that was just 3 years ago. And because of the finance thing, I also mostly rode the metro or the public buses, and it was doable, just very exhausting. The few times that I did ride a cab, I remember when I was with my cousins and we were trying to hail a cab, and they came and then they saw me and then they drove away. So
okay, because they're not supposed to. They made a big deal of it now.
Yeah,
I was just there a couple weeks ago, and they were making a big deal about it. So
no, this just happened a couple years ago. A few years ago when I was there in 2014, 2015. So my next question is, you've already kind of covered this, but what are, just talking broad stroking it a bit, what do you think are the top challenges that wheelchair users face, aside, different from other individuals? So we're parsing out individuals with disabilities and focusing specifically on wheelchair users. What are the top challenges that we face while traveling?
Biggest challenge, I think, is the unknown. is how am I going to do this? How can I leave the comfort of my own home and where I don't feel like there's, I often say, and you probably have the same thing, where in my regular daily life, I don't encounter things that I can't do. And, so, I can do most everything on a daily basis. I know what I'm doing. I can get into my car. I can get into, the restaurant. I can get into, the post office. I can do whatever I want. Whereas going to other places, it's a little bit more of a question, even just as we were talking about getting onto an airplane can be a challenge. How do we do this? Who is going to help me? The idea of, that's why I mentioned the idea of the restrooms on the plane is just having a bit of a plan beforehand of how we might be able to do it. I think the unknown, and then going to a place that might have a different culture, a different language, a different set of challenges. And there are places that you can go where you can't read any of the things that are on any of the signs, and you think, okay, I have no idea where I'm going. But I think that's where doing a little bit of advanced research, that you can figure out how to get somewhere. So, like, for instance, this past year I was doing a speech in Spain, and the way that the flights were working is that I had a direct flight from Salt Lake City to Amsterdam, but then I had 8 hours in Amsterdam before I flew to Spain. And so what I did is I did some research. I bought tickets to the Van Gogh Museum before I left. So I had my tickets already because I wanted to go to the Van Gogh Museum. And I went and figured out how to get onto the train. I bought my train tickets and everything. And so I left the airport, hopped on a train, went into the city, went through the museum, checked it out, which is a great way to get over jet lag as well, as to actually give yourself something to do when you're there. Otherwise, if you're just sitting around, you are invariably going to fall asleep, and then it's daytime and you've fallen asleep, and then you won't be able to fall asleep when it's nighttime, and then it's a mess. So I did that. And so I think that those are the things, trying to turn that unknown into something that actually is known is doing a bit of research. And it might mean contacting airlines and those kinds of things, just to figure out how people can do this, because it might not be all that public. There might not be a ton of public availability. So that might be something that's an assignment for you, to take your camera and go film getting on and off an airplane.
Yeah, definitely. What I hear from you is just a lot of planning ahead. I think for wheelchair users and any individual with or without disabilities who have fears of traveling, I think first is to plunge in and give it a try first with a location that you're comfortable with going. Then you know what to expect, what kind of things happen while you travel, and then after that you can plan ahead more effectively.
I think so, and try to bring some support as well if you're able to do that. I know that there have been numerous times that I have traveled with friends and had some pretty fit friends who have said, okay, well, this is what we're doing. I'm going to give you a piggyback and we're going to call it good, So I don't know that everybody wants to do that, and it doesn't have to be that extreme, but it's also just having someone who's strong enough potentially to be able to pick you up, carry you or pull you up in your chair up a few steps, 3, 4, 5 steps or something like that, is something that can be the difference between getting into your hotel and not getting into your hotel. And that's something that is a little bit different when we travel. We're so used to kind of cookie cutter to a certain extent, where that if you're booking at a particular brand of hotel, that it's pretty similar in New York versus San Francisco versus, and you're not encountering anything that's too much different. But when you travel, that is a challenge. So contacting them in advance to try to figure out what is the situation and what am I going to encounter.
Exactly. And I'm really glad that you covered that about supports, because I think a lot of individuals with disabilities think that if they ask for help, then it's something to be embarrassed about, to be ashamed of, when it's really not. I ask for help all the time. I know you just addressed that. Especially when you're traveling, there are unknowns all the time. You never know what's around the next corner. And so most people are happy to help. Some on occasions you'll encounter, negative feedback, but move on. Life goes on, and everything will be just fine. So
I think so. Yeah, and it really is about planning ahead and trying to have a plan for anything that can go wrong. I mean, it's the kind of thing of climbing the mountain. It's the same kind of thing. You don't know exactly what's going to go wrong, but you hope you have a plan that allows you to have multiple solutions for whatever might happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So my next question relates to the other couple questions I've asked you so far. Feel free to, don't feel that you have to repeat what you said previously, but add on to it if you feel like you have something to add. So what are some recommendations for improvement, solution plans in terms of accessible travel?
Accessible travel, first place I would go to is really to the aisle chair. I think that one, it should be more comfortable. It should be more padded. I think that there should be a bit more training for the people who are actually using it. I think that there should be sort of like 360-degree capability on the casters, the wheels that they use, because oftentimes it seems like that thing gets into a corner that it can barely get out of, and getting on and off the planes is really a challenge. That would be my biggest complaint.
And also, I feel like it would be really easy to add like a hand crank or a push rim on that as well. It doesn't have to be something that they need two staff members to function. In this day and age, that it can easily be made, where should some wheelchair users who are comfortable functioning it on their own should have the option to do.
That's a good question. I think that there's to maintain a sense of control is really the most important part. It's the thing that kills me if I have to give over control as I am traveling. I don't know that they are going to let us operate it on our own just because there's liability and those kinds of things. But there are other solutions that we can do. I remember friends of mine, European friends of mine, on their wheelchairs had what looked like tip bars, anti-tip bars, so that you wouldn't flip over doing a wheelie, but they were actually sort of underneath their axle, and they had little rollerblade wheels on them. And what it did is it gave them effectively their own aisle chair. They could pop their wheels off, their big wheels off, and roll on this thing and pull themselves to their seat without having to use the aisle chair. So I think that there are solutions if we're intending to do it. I think I don't know that we're going to get around the liability of having something that sort of is self-operated at the airport. I think that's going to be a challenge, but making it more comfortable, making it function. And actually, I think the aisle chair on the plane, the collapsible one, works better than the one that they use to put people on the plane. So I think that's a big part of it. As I said, planning ahead. I mean, I think that's the thing for all travelers. Planning ahead, knowing what you're going to encounter is really helpful, but also kind of trying to figure out the time frame and having plans B and C as far as how are we getting onto the plane, what kind of support can I have, how can I do this as easily as possible, and especially if you're doing it for the first time, you want to have those plans in place.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever had wheelchair malfunctions while you were abroad, and how did you handle some of the more tricky situations?
It's a good question. The obvious one is getting flat tires, and it seems like invariably you get a flat tire at absolutely the worst time to get a flat tire. Having spare tubes is a great way to avoid that. I did for a long time. I used solid wheels or solid tires so that I didn't have any risk of getting a flat. It's always a concern, but to be able to change a flat is a big deal, especially if you're going to a vastly different culture. Having repairs, I've heard nightmares, and I have had wheels that have been broken. They more like spokes than the actual wheel. I've heard of people who've had their wheels completely damaged to the point that they couldn't move, and that gets to be a real challenge, because there's not a whole lot you can do. I think that it really is trying to find a replacement in that particular location, and that can be a real challenge. So there are times, I know when I climbed Kilimanjaro, we had 2 separate rigs to climb the mountain, just in the event that there was anything that could go wrong. I did not have 2 separate wheelchairs, and I don't recommend doing that entirely, just because it can be a real challenge carrying all of this stuff that you have to carry anyway. I am effectively a pack rat oftentimes, and some of it is just getting bags that can work for you, that fit you. I often travel with a backpack and a duffel bag, and it's actually a duffel bag that has straps that effectively make it a backpack as well. So I can put my backpack on my back, and then I can put this other bag on my lap, but with the straps I can keep it in control as I'm going around, which makes my life much easier. Bottom of the shower, and then I have a cushion on the shower as well.
Mm-hmm. So what type of wheelchair do you use? It doesn't seem especially prone to malfunctions.
Well, it's fairly customized. I use a Box wheelchair, so Mike Box makes these wheelchairs. He was formerly with Colors, and he makes it to my specifications, which I think is a big challenge with wheelchairs. You want your wheelchair to fit as well as possible, and I think that means width of your hips. It means having it so that your feet will stay flat on the footrest. So the width of it, because it's easy enough to have a width of your footrest that's much wider than your feet, and so then invariably one foot is cocked one way and the other foot's cocked the other way. It's been from years of experience, but that to me is trying to figure out how wide are my shoes. That's how wide my wheelchair should be, my footrest should be, and how wide are my hips, because I want that to fit almost as tightly as my jeans do. I don't want to have extra room in there, because that extra room means that it prevents me from getting into some of the narrow doorways that I can get into, So, and obviously back to again, if this is going to wheelchair users, this is the most important part. The narrowest place in almost anywhere you're going to encounter is the bathroom, and that's someplace you want to get into. So if your chair is narrower, it affords you that opportunity to get into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. The last question I have for you regarding travel is, what are the perks, some advantages of traveling in a wheelchair?
What are the perks of traveling in a wheelchair? Well, you always have your seat, right? So that's a big deal. If you're in a crowded airport or somewhere, you always have your seat. Sometimes you do get enter in the back door, kind of like we were talking about with Rome, where sometimes you're getting into the entrance. Sometimes it's easier just to get around. I am amazed. I spent a lot of time at airports, and I move much more quickly than the average person. I have determined. I'm not sure. Some people seem to move really, really very slowly, but but there's the efficiency of going from place to place, which is helpful. I think that part of it is oftentimes if you do need assistance, particularly in a place with a different language and with a different culture, it's a way to make a much closer bond with people in a particular location. It changes you in some ways from being a tourist to having a familiar relationship with somebody. And I think that it provides some opportunities to make a greater connection, because generally people do want to help. And if you let them help, you sometimes will make some friends along the way.
Exactly. So we're going to move on to fitness. And so the first question regarding fitness is, why do you think it's especially important for wheelchair users to stay fit? And what are some, and then a follow-up question to that is, how can they stay fit without overutilizing the shoulder areas and avoid issues such as shoulder issues, elbow tendonitis, carpal tunnel?
So the biggest thing I think for people in wheelchairs, the fitness part of it is we use our arms as our arms have not been designed to do what we require of them. And that's just, making a transfer from here to there. That is going from one place to the other. Our arms generally are not doing that kind of an endurance thing. For the vast majority of people, able-bodied people, they're not using their arms that way. I remember getting into a chair at first and thinking, wow, I don't know if I can make it anywhere. I'm exhausted just going one block. And so one, I think it is spending time in a chair is something that can be really helpful in terms of the fitness. Just spending time. I went for like a 2 to 3 mile walk with the dog this morning, just in my everyday chair. You don't need specific equipment to make that happen, but some of it is we have to be cognizant of the strength to weight ratio. And we want to be, as we get older, oftentimes it seems like that ratio goes in the opposite direction. We start losing strength and gaining weight. And the less we weigh and the stronger we are, the more easily we are able to get in and out of a car, get in and out of bed, push our wheelchair around. The fitness becomes really our lifeblood, where we have to continually stick with it so that we are able to do what we want, because the hardest thing is getting back into shape. It's really easy to get out of shape, but if we're doing something on a daily basis, and really I think that can be just pushing around in a chair is something, just instead of driving somewhere, going somewhere in your chair can be really easy. Shoulder overuse is a big part of it. Shoulder joint can be a really weak joint. And I find for me that I am far more susceptible if I have not been doing anything. You think, oh, well, you haven't been doing anything, so that means that you should be that you should be in better shape. And it's really not the case. The more I am fit, the more I'm in the gym. The bike is a great one for the shoulder because it has a pushing motion and it has a pulling motion. Mm-hmm. So you're balancing that shoulder girdle, which is really important, because it's really easy for us to get that everything is entirely in a pushing motion. And so your triceps and your pecs and those things get much stronger, but your shoulder gets weaker as a result, because you haven't dealt with the back and the rotator cuff and these kinds of things. So it really is important to do some exercise for that when you're traveling, or even on a regular basis. Something that's really easy is just taking some elastic bands, and you can do some of the pulling exercises where you're trying to pull your shoulder blades together while stretching the rubber band. And that stuff you can do even just lying in bed, almost like an isometric kind of thing, where you're lying on your back and you can push your shoulders into the bed, and you start compensating and working on some of those muscles as well, just being aware of maintaining that balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you say bike, and you mean a hand cycle in this case
I do.
for
Yeah.
for individuals who are not as familiar with the different equipments out there. Okay, so along the same lines, so you talked about stretch band workouts, hand cycles, going to the gym. Can you elaborate on like what other recreational activities that individuals should do? And you talked about going to the gym, but what kind of things do you do at the gym?
What kind of things do I do at the gym? I generally do when I am at the gym. I am doing sort of. And this, I'm trying to answer this question without getting into too much depth as far as that. But I do a fair amount of dumbbell stuff and light dumbbell stuff for the shoulders, whether I'm doing rotator cuff kinds of things, whether I'm doing empty bottles, which is almost like sitting on a bench and turning your wrists out like you're emptying a bottle. Reverse flies, different things like that with weight that is often 5 to 10 pounds. I mean, 10 pounds and less. I mean, sometimes it's 2.5 pounds. So you can get, and sometimes you can get a good workout doing this without even having any weight, just using the weight of your arms. And I generally try to do 2 pulling exercises for every pushing exercise. So much of our strength is tricep and pecs, but at the same time, maintaining that shoulder stability is paramount to our health. So those are when I'm in the gym, that's what I do. But I think that there are a variety of different things that are important. Like I said, I mean, walking the dog can be a workout. That's going out for a walk can definitely be a workout. Hand cycle, I think, is a great workout. I have not done much of it, but I think I'm going to start doing more like kayaking and those kinds of things. But just to keep it simple, I think that one of the biggest things is just go out and off-road hand cycle obviously is one too. But to keep it simple, being in our wheelchair, that can be a good solid workout. And I think that there are different parts of it, like we were talking about with the hand cycle, where you can go along a flat bike trail, or you can decide, okay, I'm going to go up this hill, or I'm going to go up this hill and I'm going to sprint up part of this hill. So there are a variety of different things that you can do without having to have any additional equipment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, those are great. Have you personally experienced any of the issues that I mentioned earlier? Elbow tendonitis, carpal tunnel, shoulder issues? And if so, how have you dealt with these issues?
The biggest problem I've had has been with my shoulder, because I had a traumatic event. I was ski racing, or actually I was training, and fell with my arm extended over my head and tore, nothing completely, but tore a bunch of things in my shoulder. I was about to go in for surgery, and this is years later that I was about to go in for surgery, just because it kept getting weaker and weaker, and there wasn't much I could do. I was doing all the exercises and trying to get it stronger, and I just couldn't get there. And I didn't go in for surgery. I actually did platelet replacement therapy, which is called PRP, and it ended up working great for me. The doctor drew blood from me, I don't know, 40 milliliters, I think, and then spun it down to 4 milliliters of platelets, so really of like the red blood cell kind of thing, the rich stuff, and injected that into the tears in my shoulder. And doing that, what it did, the analogy he used is it was like pouring cement into a crack on the sidewalk. It ended up working out really well for me. Mm-hmm. I ended up avoiding surgery, and while my left shoulder is...
So the next section that we are going to go on to is advocacy. So how to advocate for yourself and how to advocate for your community. And this community I'm talking about is specifically the disability community. So the first question I'm going to ask is, so you got injured in 1988 when you were already in college, right? So you were at least 18 years old.
I was 20 years old, actually, yes.
You were 20 years old at the time. And so I see that a lot of these languages that you use to describe things that you do are what able-bodied people do, right? Like walking your dog or sprinting, like things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because especially if you got injured so late in life, and that's the language that you use all throughout your life. But what I'm asking is, since you've been living with this injury and adapted to the life of a person who has a disability, has your language changed? Has your identity changed with this new set of language?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a dilemma for a lot of us, is trying to figure out how to be a good advocate for ourselves. And I think one of the things that I look at is trying to be universal. I mean, it's part of the, like with One Revolution, our motto is, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. And it's intentionally universal in that we all are encountering struggles. And I think part of the responsibility for us as wheelchair users is to be able to educate people how best they might be able to help us, but also to remember that we don't want to make people wrong. I think that interactions can become really adversarial, and that's not going to benefit us, even though it might sort of work in the moment, and we're bringing a lot of anger that all of a sudden my life is easier and you need to make my life better. I think that we have to be willing to take that step back and just say, I had an aunt at one point who always used to say, So I have a problem here. I'm wondering how you might be able to help me with this problem. And people were always, people always reacted well to that. How can I help you? Yes, if you have a problem, I'm wondering if how I can help you with it. Yes, I'd love to do that. So I think that some of it is we've got to approach things this way. And I see it all the time. I see it all the time when I'm traveling and there's a flight delay or something like that. And somebody is just screaming up and down at the person at the gate, and there's very little that they can do. And even what they can do, they're less inclined to do it if you're telling them that they're wrong. None of us want to be wrong. So we have to find a way to approach that situation in a way of, well, I'm having a bit of problem. I'm wondering if you might be able to help me here. The universal part of it is that we really are in a situation where we all have struggles, and I think that if we can bring other people into sharing our struggle, then we're in a situation where they can relate to us as a peer. So I don't know that some of the language, we've got to be aware of language that is different. But if we're going to use language that's different, we have to define what that language is. We have to define what that means, because we can't make the assumption that somebody else is going to know. So if it's our language within the wheelchair world, we have to take responsibility for allowing somebody else, for enabling somebody else to understand what that means. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, unfortunately, the responsibility in a lot of ways is on us, but I think that the things we want to avoid being completely separate and completely different. We might have some different needs, but we want to be able to bring people into a place where, one, they can understand what our needs are, and two, where they can relate to those needs, because they're far more likely to be receptive beyond the letter of the law if they're able to see us as individuals. And I hope.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned that you're writing a memoir. So I think this question will really come in handy. And your book will come in handy in helping you answer this question. So, growing up, what would you have changed about how others advocated for you, whether that be your parents or your friends or other family members or your teachers? What methods did they use or mannerisms did they exhibit that you were uncomfortable with? And if you weren't uncomfortable with, what did they do right that should be repeated for others?
I think that probably the easiest answer with that is that the thing that I was most uncomfortable with was probably also the greatest gift. I think my parents were, I think that my parents were, a lot of the responsibility was on us when things went wrong, and so I think that the thing that I might have thought as a kid was that, well, they should do more. They should help me more. And if something went wrong, they said, okay, well, what are you going to do? And it's like, well, what do you mean? Aren't you going to fix this? Like, something's gone wrong here. And for them, that was really more of the teaching opportunity to teach me that things were going to go wrong, and that it wasn't a matter of when things went wrong or whether things went wrong, because they were definitely going to. It was a matter of what you were going to do and what you were going to learn, because it was a learning opportunity. And I think that as far as advocates, probably the biggest thing is that my parents put the responsibility on me to be my advocate. And obviously they were happy to answer questions and offer advice and different things like that. But at the same time, gaining that sense of responsibility was something that was really important, and I think that is that is part of it, and also I think having your eyes open to how people do it well and how people do it differently. So it was a great learning experience trying to see. I mentioned my aunt who, I have a problem here. I'm wondering how you can help me. It's entirely different than you need to fix this. It's an entirely different situation, and trying to figure out how that works. I think that's part of the growing process, is learning a sense of advocacy and having a variety of different techniques and strategy for creating that. And some of it, I think, is realizing that it's important for us to connect with the person first, as opposed to the ask first, and realizing that charismatic connection is often on us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, what were some of your proudest memories of either advocating for yourself or for others?
Or for others. I think that some of what I've tried to do is present an opportunity for people to view me in a comfortable light. So I mentioned that we did a documentary film about the Kilimanjaro climb. It's not mainstream, it's not Star Wars or anything, but at the same time, a fair number of people have seen that. And I think from the comfort of their living room or the comfort of the theater, they're able to put themselves in my situation, in my position. I am I'm the protagonist of this film, and that's what we do, is we put ourselves in the position of the protagonist when we're watching this film. And I think that that as a proud moment, that's something that I orchestrated, but it was an opportunity for people to see the humanity in me. And I think that is a greater sense of advocacy in terms of is recognizing that we are all representatives of this cause, and what I do might affect how somebody treats you down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think conceptualization and image is very important. So going back, the last question in this section is going back to language again. I think language really is very important, especially for how people give identity to different groups. So, are you comfortable with being labeled disabled or an individual with a disability? And if not, what alternative words would you use to conceptualize that group of population?
I am completely fine with being labeled disabled or a person with a disability or whatever it is. I tend to look at it in terms of what is the, what's the intention that somebody's bringing to it. If somebody's condescending to me, then that's offensive. And if they're not, I don't really care. I don't really care what the word is. It seems like words move in and out so quickly. I wrote a blog at one point after a conversation with somebody where disabled became the more favored of the words as opposed to handicapped, which then was seen as an antiquated kind of term to apply to somebody. But in a lot of ways, if you look at handicapped, it's more of a flattering term in that. So like if there's a handicapping going on in the horses, certain horses have to carry more weight. They are handicapped because they are too fast. And so you look at it and think, okay, well, that seems like a fairly decent term. Like you as an individual are carrying a little bit more of a burden just because you are a far greater individual, and the connotation. But then there's another connotation that is cap in hand that literally is about begging. That one of the assumptions of people within this community is that it's all about a handout and not an exchange of value for value. So it can be pejorative in that sense. But, I think that sometimes we can force people to come up with a proper term so much that they just don't say anything. And I don't want to hold that high a responsibility to people. I really want people to starting a conversation with somebody you don't know is a difficult thing, and I think that that I want to honor the intention of somebody who wants to connect with me, and sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's not. Sport, in a lot of ways, for me has been the easiest part because it's a common bond. We're trying to do the same thing. If we're skiing, we're trying to do the same thing, and people have an easier way of connecting with me because they can connect through the sport or they can connect through the equipment. And it's a challenge. It really is a challenge it's a challenge for people to connect with us because I think that they are so conscious of political correctness and conscious of potentially insulting somebody that it's easy for us to become invisible as a result. It's easy for them to turn and just not make any connection at all. So I don't want to heighten that sense of responsibility by really emphasizing whatever is the term in vogue. I'm much more conscious of honoring the intention of connecting with me as a person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree with that. I think what you're trying to say is, although language is very important, connecting with people and seeing the intentions behind it, because sometimes they may not use the right words, but they have the best of intentions. For example, yesterday, this woman had the best of intentions, was trying to help me go up a ramp on the bus, but I was waiting because the bus driver was trying to pull the seats up, and he had the bus door open. I had the door open, so I couldn't go quite all the way up yet. So I was waiting for that. But she didn't know, so she started to just push me into the door. And so I think this is when good intentions, lack of exposure, and lack of experience with individuals with disabilities, whether that be wheelchair users or individuals that are blind. I think more exposure, more communication is always good. So
the communication part is important, and I think that people should ask questions as opposed to making assumptions. Mm-hmm. That if somebody's pushing you up that ramp, there might be a reason that you're not going up that ramp at the moment. Mm-hmm. also accepting, accepting that no, thank you is a perfectly valid answer. Can I give you a hand? No, thank you. I'm all set. And I think that is a valid answer, and I hope that people will respect it, because I've definitely, there are times where I've had to accept assistance that have actually made it more challenging for me than doing it myself. Because sometimes you have to educate people how to make it work, and sometimes like you're saying, that this woman desperately wants to help, and that is absolutely wonderful. But at the same time, she put you in a more difficult situation as a result of her help. And so I think that's where the communication and where we do have to be open to a sense of communication, and where people are able to talk to us.
Mm-hmm. Which is why I think it's so important that you're creating that film and writing a memoir and sharing your story, because there is not enough exposure out there, and people really just, a lot of it is just ignorance, rather that be intentional or unintentional. I think a lot of it is unintentional ignorance. In the media is very powerful, and having more individuals with a variety of disabilities more present and visible in the media would help a lot. But that's another story altogether. Anyways, we're going to wrap it up here today. Thank you so much for talking to me and having such deep, lively discussions on the various issues, topics here. So thank you, Chris.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.